In 1840, Hippolyte Bayard, having learned that the French Academy of Sciences had awarded the patent for the invention of photography, an invention that he himself dedicated years of his life developing, left this photograph as his suicide note. On the back it read, "The corpse which you see here is that of M. Bayard, inventor of the process that has just been shown to you. As far as I know, this indefatigable experimenter has been occupied for about 3 years with his discovery. The government, which has been only too generous to Monsieur de Guerre, has said it can do nothing for Monsieur Bayard, and the poor wretch has drowned himself. Oh, the vagaries of human life! He has been at the morgue for several days, and no one has recognized or claimed him. Ladies and gentlemen, you better pass along for fear of offending your sense of smell, for as you can observe, the face and hands of the gentleman are beginning to decay." He never actually attempted to take his own life. The photograph is a fiction. In fact, it is the first example of conceptual art in photography, and it would change the art world forever. In this audio-visual gallery guide, I will take you through 5 of the most influential art movements throughout the 20th century leading up to today, and the photographers that led them. These photographers were fundamental in defining the characteristics of these art movements and really demonstrate just what an art movement is. After the invention of photography in 1826, and its official introduction to the public in 1836, the predominant use of the medium was as a tool, either for science or to assist with traditional painting, as the pioneers worked tirelessly to improve its technical prowess by developing new printing techniques and refining optics to create sharper and sharper images. The question of photography as an art form remained unclear until the beginning of pictorialism in 1869, when Henry Peach Robinson published his book, Pictorial Effect in Photography, being hints on composition and chiaroscuro for photographers. Although he had been developing his particular artistic techniques of using multiple prints to create fictional and often romantic scenes for over a decade prior, the defining principle behind the rise of pictorialism was that straight photography, being a direct representation of real life, was devoid of artistic intent or message. In contrast to this, pictorialism tended towards a much softer focus and the use of moody, dramatic lighting to communicate artistic ideas. It borrowed heavily from the Romantic era of painting in its mythical and religious subject matters, and a chiaroscuro lighting tone popularized by the painter Caravaggio. As a further step away from reality, the negatives were often manipulated or altered, sometimes even using paintbrushes which helped blur the line between traditional painted art and photography. Contextually, the traditional art world at the time had moved away from the fictional and ethereal subjects of the Romantic era and into realism in order to return the artist's gaze back to the natural world. This propagated the idea of photography as a tool for art, where painters such as Delacroix and Degas often incorporated photography into their painting by using photographs as a reference tool to aid in the recreation of subjects they saw before them. It is because of this that an art movement such as pictorialism needed such juxtaposition of styles in order to elevate itself beyond its practical application. The art and photography world finally collided in the 1880s with the advent of tonalism and impressionism, which influenced the pictorialist movement heavily. The idea that art should communicate emotion through atmosphere worked seamlessly with the pictorialist's soft features and moody lighting, and through the multiple negative printing techniques, this allowed photographers of the movement to develop visual communication techniques in order to tell their stories. Pictorialism's most prominent decade came between 1900 and 1910, before mostly dying off after 1915. Due to the speed of communication in this era, Pictorialism can be considered the first international art movement, as photography clubs around the world, from America to Australia, would send each other work to exhibit. Prominent photographers of this decade including Robert Dimaschi, with his moody urban landscapes and heavy brushstrokes on his nude portraits, Alfred Stieglitz, who curated many photographers' work in his publication Photo Secession, and John Kaufman, who helped bring the movement to Australia. As modernism took hold of the art world, with a step away from composition and aesthetic, instead focusing on line, detail, shape and form as the formal elements of visual communication. In revolutionary Russia, the constructivism movement was born from the mind of Vladimir Tatlin. Where traditional art movements were seen as being for the bourgeoisie, constructivism was seen as the art movement of the proletariat, with a focus on material and function. More of a philosophy than an art movement, constructivism was used as a practice for social purpose, and its influence was far-reaching in sculpture, architecture, and even theatre. Sculpture took on an industrial look, almost completely rejecting aesthetic as an artistic merit. Constructivist photography, on the other hand, took a much softer approach by seeing art in the function of the formal elements themselves. Photographers such as Alexander Rodchenko, for instance, saw the city he lived in as a machine, with the people being its mechanical parts. He ignored almost every rule of composition and favoured deep tones, strong lines and plunging perspectives. It was as though he tried to integrate himself into the form of the city landscape in order to provide an internal perspective of the moving parts, its people. In service of the Russian Revolution, constructivist influences tied in heavily to graphic design, and therefore lent itself to photo collage and propaganda posters. As photography took on a much more abstract quality, with a much deeper focus on detail as a function of art, the Bolsheviks in power began to reject the art form as its avant-garde nature put it too close to traditional pure art and therefore was not for the people. Therefore, constructivism was short-lived in Russia, only being prominent in the early 1920s and dying out by the 1930s. As with many art movements, Futurism was a rejection of the conventions of photography by exploring and breaking its boundaries and limits. One of the most fundamental aspects of photography was its ability to freeze time. First photographs, however, broke this convention by requiring exposure times of minutes, if not hours. As the pioneers developed their techniques through the 19th century, this exposure time was brought down to fractions of a second, and with the popularization of transparency film by the Eastman Kodak Company, the idea of capturing a moment became the defining feature of photography. Equally, as traditional art mediums tried to find their place in a world where anyone could capture a perfect landscape or portrait in under a second, the boundaries of art were explored in order to find new and exciting ways to communicate ideas. As such, much more conceptual art movements such as Cubism, Dadaism, and Surrealism took hold. Whereas Cubism explored the spatial dimensions in an attempt to unfold reality and experience multiple perspectives at the same time, Futurism explored the nature of time as a dimension and its progression through a single frame. Its roots can be traced back to scientific exploration of photography, with Edward Muybridge trying to record the gait of a horse by using many well-timed exposures to record movement over time. In Futurism, however, multiple exposures and lighting techniques over long exposures were used to record motion in a single photograph using a technique called photodynamism. Although as an art movement it focused on technology, it neglected photography until 1930, when Marinetti and Tato published the Futurist Photography Manifesto. Most prominent in Italy during this decade, the influences of the National Fascist Party can be felt heavily in Italian Futurist photography, who used it as a tool to blur the line between pure art and social function. The Italian Futurist photography had the same appreciation of motion, violence, and dynamic change, breaking the convention of mediums like portraiture by recording multiple, expressive, often vulgar emotions at the same time. The 1930s also saw the combination of photography with other art forms such as dance and performance art, which blended well with its dynamic depiction of time and motion. Running alongside almost every other art movement in photography, documentary photography stepped away from the notions of conceptual or pure art by viewing the recording of the real world an art form in itself. The camera's potential for social purpose was fully utilized in documentary photography as a way to record the lives and stories of people and the environment in a way that had never been done before. It shone a spotlight on the world by making these stories readily available to a much wider audience and made it a powerful tool for social change. Its influences can be strongly felt in photojournalism and street photography, although where those two movements focused more on capturing a moment, documentary photography was seen as much more of an ongoing process where events are recorded over a long period of time. While not necessarily intended as an art movement, documentary photography cements itself as one of the most important movements of the 20th century as it honed and developed techniques of visual communication. Whereas photojournalism usually came accompanied with a written article in order to give the photograph context, documentary photographs should tell the story all by themselves. This led to a conflict, however, regarding the truth of photography. While seen by many as the most accurate representation of the real world, it has many constraints, and it is the photographer's conscious decisions that dictate how the story is told within those constraints. As explored by the Dadaists and the Surrealists, photographs have edges. The photograph must select what contextual information will be supplied alongside their subject matter in order to assist the story within those edges. This inherent censorship can have a dramatic impact on the interpretation of the photograph by the audience. At the same time, the arrangement of contextual information through the formal elements can be equally effective in directing the audience's attention to what the photographer wants them to see. In Dorothea Lange's considered portraits of poor farmers during the American Depression, the choice to ask the subject to look outside of the frame to the left or right can have dramatic influences on whether the subject is interpreted to be hopeful and looking to the future, or nostalgic and reflecting on the past. Documentary photography is as endless in its scope as its subject matter, from the works of Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange's record of depression in rural America to Brassai's documentation of the seedy underground in Paris, the typological record of Victorian structures by Berndt and Hillebescher, the environmental landscapes of Ansel Adams, and Martin Parr's intimate exploration of British seaside towns. In fact, on a trip to Bristol, I visited the Martin Parr Foundation to see an exhibit of 4 photographers documenting the lives of people living in Scotland in the last decade. One of the photographers that stood out to me was Jeremy Sutton Hibbert, who over the last few years has documented the turbulent political landscape that has inhabited Scotland, with the independence referendum of 2014, 2 general elections, and the Brexit referendum, in which Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain. One photograph in particular stood out to me from the entire gallery. On first glance, I thought the barricade fencing and traffic cones meant that this was a soon-to-be construction site. Upon further inspection, though, I realized that these barricades were due to a recent protest or political rally, and that the bent and trampled fences were due to an event of civil unrest. It was clearly important that this photograph was taken after the fact of this site of intense emotion, as it demonstrates the lasting damage political discourse is having on the nation, but also the temporary nature of that damage. Within a few weeks, everything here will be repaired, the streets will be cleared, and even the message graffitied on the wall, which at the time was such a pure expression of what this person was feeling, will be gone. Save for this photograph, that is. This idea of giving permanence to events or ideas that are temporary through photography inspired me to go out into the city of Bristol and take my own documentary photograph. Around my hometown of Cardiff, which is a predominantly student city similar to Bristol, there has been an increase in Brexit-related political activism and graffiti. Seeing as Bristol is a safe Liberal Democrat seat which are strong spokespeople for Remain and a second referendum, and home to many works of Banksy, I thought it would be the ideal city to find a piece of public declaration of political activism. To my surprise, however, this proved more difficult than I first thought. Graffiti itself was much more scarce, and when I did find it, it would usually only be tags or non-political art. Eventually, however, I came across this. A series of fragile plaster statues chained around the plinth of a long-standing statue with labels assigning the roles of the immigrant workforce in Britain, who are the forgotten victims of Brexit. I was struck by the fragility of the materials used in contrast to the solid concrete and stone slabs of the plinth and floor, demonstrating the vulnerability of the people we have worked alongside for decades that are now being either discarded or used as pawns in political warfare. The statues have since been cleaned up from this particular square in Bristol, making this photograph one of the only records of its existence that I know of. Postmodernism was born out of a reaction to the ideas of modernism, which included constructivism, documentary photography, and futurism. Modernism focused on detail and structure as the subject of arts, often with a focus on structure, in order to explore the foundations of reality. In contrast to this, postmodernism explored the nature of reality itself. It declared that definitions and boundaries could not accurately represent the truth of reality, and that the only version of reality that mattered is one's own personal experience of it, even if that meant the truth was either subjective or non-existent. Just as modernism can be used as an umbrella term for the art movements that occurred post-World War I leading up to the 1960s, postmodernism can similarly be used as an umbrella term that covers several other art movements. However, by its very nature, does not define those movements. There are certain features that can be found throughout postmodernism. Skepticism is most notable throughout postmodern art, as the artist not only questioned idealistic approaches to the world, but the very nature of what art even is. Who decides what art is? Does art even exist? Irony is another feature that can be found in postmodernism. Through intertextuality, pastiche, and parody, postmodernists examines, explores, and questions our pretenses and prejudices towards facets of society and bridges the gap, sometimes destroying the boundary of high and mass pop culture, giving it a reputation for anti-authoritarianism. These questions of what is real and what is art meant that photography was an ideal medium for postmodernism to lend itself to. Photography can best be described as the communication of an idea or subject that the photographer felt was important enough to share with the world. Modernism developed the language with which photography communicates, with a focus on form, structure, and detail. Postmodernism then used that language to focus on the subject, even if the subject is itself an idea. While some photographers chose appropriation to explore our ideas of what art is, others took focus on simulacra, in which a third level of reality is explored. Post-feminism influenced these photographers heavily, where rather than creating feminist art for the purpose of activism and a goal, instead they explored the ideas of what a gender even is and how gender roles fit into a modern society of equal rights. Photographers like Cindy Sherman created pastiches of the kind of representations women had in cinema during the 1950s. These movie scenes do not exist, the characters do not exist, and the photographs cannot be traced back to any one influence, but they communicate exactly the same ideas of what these characters would have been like in the cinema at the time, even if that's not an accurate depiction of women at the time. It's this idea of an image of an image of an image of an idea that fits so well with postmodernist ideas.